This is an intro. Who needs an intro? I don't need an intro. This is just a vape show. It's just a vape show. Vape show. This is an intro. Who needs an intro? I don't need an intro. This is just a vape show. It's just a vape show. Vape show.
So YouTube, what's up? I'm your homeboy Josh, back at you, and today we're going to go into a bit more detail about the build we threw together for the Bonza RDA, which would be the Slentre Diamondback Braidiator. The Slentre Braidiator, by definition, is a vertebraid coil that involves one or more round wire cores around which you're doing your vertebraid. There are endless possibilities as to how many cores you can use, as to how many loops you can use. You can actually use about 7 loops. I don't think you can do, I mean, I guess you could do 9 if you really wanted to get crazy, but I couldn't imagine doing more than that. I guess you could, yeah, I guess you could do 9 if you're a nutcase. Somehow. I wouldn't suggest doing more than 7 loops, and I really like using 5 loops myself. 5 loops is kind of like the magic number in terms of how many wires you're going to be braiding with. 5 loops, you're talking about 10 wires in total that's braiding together to make some sort of a pattern, to make some sort of a braid here. And 2 cores is, even just with that, you've got a number of ways that you can build your Slentre braid. This one, the way we're building it today for the Bonza RDA, is a Diamondback Braidiator. And the reason is because the braid itself, when it's all said and done, you've got sort of a diamond sort of shape down the middle created by the braid. I've chosen to make this braid with 2 strands of 26 gauge and 5 strands of 36 gauge that have been looped over. Now, in making this braid originally, experimenting with it, I went through several different iterations, and I tried different sort of loops and patterns to see what I wanted to make. And the point is, it really is just endless, and you can use different gauges to get different kinds of effects. For instance, I made one that almost kind of came out using 32 gauge for the loops, and the 32 gauge, it's just massive braid. I might end up putting it in an RDA at some point because it kind of came together and kind of didn't, but it's gonna work. But it's thick. It's a thick, chunky wire. Even this one, using 36 over 26, all I would comfortably put inside the Bonza RDA would be 4 wraps on either side. I wouldn't do 5, to be honest with you, just because it's so damn big. Now, starting this build out, what I like to do is first create my loops for the braid. A word on measurements. I'm the kind of person that likes to measure just by, how many times the wire comes off the spool, how many times that little catch rolls around in my eyes, and I can see, how much distance I'm taking off the spool there. And then to straighten the wire, all I'm doing is I'm just stretching the wire a little bit with my pliers so that it's good and straight. I'm not even using a power tool or anything to straighten the wires for the braid. I'm just doing a little tug on the wire, a short, subtle pull straightens the wire perfectly. And I do that about 5 times, 4 times off the spool. Gives me enough space to have, enough leeway to move around a bit. Okay. Once I've gotten 5 strands off the spool, 4 times off the spool, and they're all laid together, you can do this a couple different ways. You can, loop each one and then just twist it with your fingers. You can twist it using a power tool. I'm doing this power tool free pretty much. I prefer that. I've done it both ways. I must have had about 5 or 6 different attempts at this build before I got one that I was satisfied with. Okay, it's not an easy build, but we'll come back to that. The way I liked doing it the best in terms of prepping my loops was to create my 5 strands of wire, take them all together, put them end to end, take my pliers, hold down on them, and then twist all the wires together nice and easy. And then from there might be some tangles, but they're relatively easy to work out. With that done, I go ahead and I take my 26 gauge wire. Now, I originally was doing this with 28, And I gotta tell you, I like the 26 just a little bit better. It just holds up a little bit better than the 28. We'll come back to why in a bit, but I like the 26. So the 26 is the same thing. I don't need to use a power tool necessarily to straighten the 26. I just need to pull really hard. So I take the 26 about 2 times off the spool. To be honest, you could probably get away with doing 1 time. I like to do 2 times just so I have a little bit more room to work with when I'm first starting out. It makes it a little bit easier when I'm starting the braid. A little bit more to focus on, but we'll come back to why in a bit. And the way I find my center of a wire I want to cut in half is, like I said, I'm not big on measuring things. I don't use a ruler, I don't use whatever, I use whatever's around me. My table has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 sections of wood, and I use those sections of wood to find the middle. I put the wire across, perpendicular, across 2 of the beams of the wood, and then I look on one end of that beam and the other end of the other beam, and I center them over there, find it so it's equidistant, that it's coming over or under the 4th and 1st beam, and then I just clip in the middle. It makes it really easy for me to quickly find the center at an eyeball. And then I'll just put the 2 wires together. They're more or less the same length, but I'll just clip them off together right then and there so that they're even. And then to finish the prep for the build here, I'm going to take my pliers again, and I'm going to hold the loops of wires that I've created where I've twisted them together, and the edges of the 2 cores, clamp them in my pliers. I'm just going to wrap around the 2 wires with, whatever's been twisted together of my loops. So it's all twisted together, they're all kind of semi-secure. It doesn't have to be perfect because I'm going to seat them into my vise. Now, there are different kinds of vices you can use for this, and there's different ways that you can position your wire, of course. Some people, what I've seen, I watched a bunch of videos on making this wire because different people have different techniques, and that's the way we learn, is watching other people. Way I learn is watching other people do this, seeing what I like of that technique, what I like of this technique, and I kind of build my own sort of methodology of making my build. I tried it several different ways. I tried having the wires coming out at me, pointing at me. I tried them standing up vertically. I really found that the way it worked best for me was to stand the wires up, the core wires up vertically. And then I've got the loop stretched out toward me. And it made it much easier for me to manage the wires, because what makes this build difficult, at least for me, was when I first started it, figuring out and keeping it straight as to which wire I'm looping over. Because I'm making a vertebraid, for starters, all right? I'm taking my operator finger, which is my index finger, and I've got 2 loops on, I've got a loop here and a loop here, and I've got 1, 2, 3 loops here. And I'm moving my finger through the wire on this finger, through the wire on this finger, and latching onto the wire on this finger and pulling the wire through these 2 loops is what I'm doing to create my vertebraid. That's a standard vertebraid, okay? That's all there is to a vertebraid. You've got, 5 loops, and you've got an operator finger. Your operator finger is going through the first loops on the opposite hand's index and middle fingers, grasping the wire from the ring finger and pulling it on through those loops and pulling it tight. That's how you make a standard vertebraid. That's all there is to that. But now with the Slentre braid, we're adding an extra step. Now with the Slentre braid, standard thing to do would be just to loop the wire over both the cores and pull it tight. And then you got your operator finger on this finger now, because you've moved these 2 wires down 2 fingers. Just, it kind of becomes like an easy movement over time. You get used to it. First time that I started doing braids, it was, it's kind of an adjustment learning these. You move in slow motion, but over time, you get faster and faster. So once your operator on this hand has taken the loop of wire off this ring finger, you got to move this wire on the middle finger over to the ring finger, and then move this wire on the pointer finger over to the middle finger, and now Now that this is the operator, you're doing the same thing, but then you're taking the operator here, moving through the loop on this finger, through the loop on this finger, grasping the wire on your ring finger here and pulling it through those loops. So you're just doing the same thing. Now in a standard slender braid, you just be looping these 2 cores through this and just pulling it tight. So you're just marrying those 2 cores within this braid that way. But you can get more creative. You can use these 2 cores and make more patterns by using the cores and using them to create more intricacy and more variation in your wire. Now with the Diamondback Slentre Braid, you're going to do something just a little bit different, and that's instead of looping the wire over both the cores, you're looping it over the inside core. That is, as you're taking your operator finger and you're pulling that loop from your ring finger on your opposite hand, and you're taking that loop of wire through the other 2 loops on the way out, before you pull it tight, you're going to take that loop of wire and put it up over that inside core. Not the outside core, the inside core. If you do it over the outside core, you're going to end up with 2 diamonds on either side. The inside core, you're going to end up with 1 diamond down the middle. We'll probably do the opposite maybe next week or something. But looping that wire over the inside core, then pulling it tight, you know, it's that extra step that's going to create that diamond pattern. Now where it gets difficult, where it got difficult for me at first, was remembering which wire I'm looping over. That was the first challenge for me. It's easy to make mistakes when you're making a braid. Lose track of what you're doing, which finger went where did we leave off, and then the braid just, you know, it's easy to put a finger in the wrong place and then everything just comes out ugly. One wrong move and then that pattern is interrupted, and it's obvious. It's not something that you can just go back and fix because you don't know what you did, really. At least I don't know what I did at that point. And it's hard to fix. It's not a forgiving wire if you make a mistake. You need to stay focused when you're making this build. You need to stay on the ball, remember what you did and what your next step is. If you lose track of what you're doing, you're done. So for me, getting used to this, figuring out which wire went where and getting in the habit of putting that wire down on the inside core, the way I did it at first was, before I started moving my operator finger through the loops of the opposite hand, I would take the cores and I would move them in opposite directions. And I knew that the one that was most downward would be the one that would have the loop going over it. And I did that for a little while until I got the hang of it. I may have done 1 or 2 attempts of the braid doing that before it stuck, and I remembered, okay, with this particular braid, I'm going through the inside core on when I take that operator finger out, and it made it easy for me to get the hang of that. And then as I got a bit faster and I got a bit more comfortable with it, I stopped doing that and just went about my business, you know, making my braid. The other thing that can happen, and this is what I found would happen to me the most, and it's the reason I decided to have those wires vertical rather than horizontal, the core wires. What kept happening for me, and maybe it doesn't happen for people who are more experienced with braiding, is that I didn't find it easy, I still don't find it easy, to just on the way out of that loop with my operator finger, just to loop it on there and keep going. I don't see how people do that if they do it. For me, it was more like I needed to take my operator finger, grasp it in my thumb like this with the loop, and then slip the loop over, and then I could pull it tight. That's the only way I've been able to do it. And that's why I needed them vertical. I needed them vertical so that I had that angle where I could take the loop and slip it over that vertical wire. And I needed the wires long at first. I would actually stop like as the loop started to get a bit tighter and it became harder for me to take that loop and place it over that vertical core. I would take my clippers and I would cut the core wires shorter when it made sense to do so. But I needed them high so that I could see what I was doing, so that I could, you know, feel that movement of taking that loop and slipping it over that core wire before pulling it tight. That's what helped me to do it. Because otherwise, what kept happening was, as I was trying to loop my wire, my operator finger and its wire over that core wire, what would happen is the wire on this finger next to my operator finger, that wire kept getting looped over the wire first or second, or I'm not sure which, but whenever that wire here on my middle finger ended up getting looped over one of the cores, everything fell apart. I would try my damnedest to get it untangled, to figure out how this wire had gotten looped over that core, and I could never figure it out. And I'd end up, you know, thinking that I'd fixed it, pulling it tight, and then realizing, crap, I've screwed the wire up. There's no fixing it now. There goes an inch of wire. And it would happen at exactly every inch. Every inch, I would fuck that up, and the wire would be useless, because I get an inch of good wire and think, I've got a momentum now, I'm doing it, I'm going, and it would get screwed up. Other things that would happen for me was, you know, I'm filming this too, so I would have to free up a hand so I could move my camera a little bit, or free up my hand so that I could adjust my zoom or adjust my lens, or I'd put on a macro lens or something. You can't really, is the thing. It's hard to keep it straight. If you can do it without stopping, don't stop. That's what I have to say. Don't stop braiding if you can help it. A lot of the footage that I actually have from the braid is from failed attempts, because of me having to stop and move my camera around and then throwing out that wire. I threw out most of my failed attempts. I still have like 3 or 4 of them to show you, which we'll get to at some point maybe. But the point is, once you start, you don't really want to stop if you can help it. And if you do have to stop, well, you want to make sure that you're putting the wires down and securing them on something that if you need to pause, you can come back and pick it up. This is not a fast braid to make. The fastest I can get through it, and after doing it, you know, to the point where I feel pretty comfortable making it, 90 minutes to get a single wire, a single coil wire, not even two wires. I need to make these separately. It's 90 minutes to do one, then 90 minutes to do the other. So it's a time-consuming process. Is it worth it? Yeah, it's a very, very tasty vape. I mean, when you think about it, you're essentially making a fused Clapton in braid form with interlocking wires going all over the place, just creating this net, this braided net for juice to set in and just travel to those cores. It's delightful. So the payoff is worth it, but it's a lot of work, a lot of fucking work. So far, some major tips I've given you. Having the wire vertical, the core wires vertical, keeping them long at first, cutting them down as you get a little bit closer. It makes it a little bit easier when you're looping that wire over. The key is to keep those wires, those core wires, as vertical as possible. As the wire gets bigger and bigger, longer and longer rather, I found that the wire wanted to move as I was working. And that's also where, you know, that wire looped around the middle finger kept coming back to bite me in the ass. When I was taking my operator finger, trying to loop it over that inside core wire, I kept getting the middle finger, the wire that the middle finger was holding, looped around one of the wires in the process. And that would fuck me every time. Having the wires longer helped. Taking the time to make sure that the wire is not moving as much as possible helped. Having the wire vertical and ensuring the least movement possible was the way to get this thing done, the way to move through it most effectively. Now, as the wire gets longer and longer, more the braid gets done, And you can watch it coming together. It's kind of cool watching it come together. What's nice about doing it vertically is that you can see the back end of the wire as you're putting it together, and then if you fold the wire over, you can see what's going to be the front end of the wire. You can make sure it's coming together nicely. That's the other nice thing about having it vertical. But as the wire's getting longer and longer, it wants to move forward more and more as you're bringing that operator finger through the loops. The wire wants to come toward you, and as the wire comes toward you and you're trying to loop the wire over that core, it makes it easier and easier, made it easier and easier for me to accidentally let that wire on my middle finger slip over the core and screw me up. So what helped me there was A, keeping the wires longer, and B, every now and again bending the whole wire that I was making backwards. And this is where the 26 gauge comes in. As the wire is being pulled this way and then you're working to push it back that way, and the wire is being pulled toward you and pushed back, it's weakening the core where, you know, it's in the vise. So over time, I'd feel the wire break. And with the 28 gauge, it became harder and harder to keep the wire from breaking. The 26 was a bit tougher, a bit more resilient to that kind of movement, and it was a lot longer before the wire would break, and I really only had to reseat the wire back into the vise only about once if I was using 26 gauge. So the wire being longer, the wire being of a wider gauge for the core, allowing for the wire to be pushed back to avoid my accidentally putting a wire that wasn't supposed to go over the core wire is what eventually allowed me to get from beginning to end on this build. And those are, you know, mistakes that I made and reconsidered, and, you know, and fixes that I evolved for this, building this wire over the course of, I don't know, 10 attempts, something like that. It took me a little while. But once I'd finished one attempt perfectly, the second one that I made perfectly was the next coil that I made. So using those techniques that I picked up through the process of making this coil from beginning to end is what made me successful at making this build. And that's just, you know, commitment. Commitment to getting from beginning to end and finding a fix and finding a solution through it. It's what I love about coil building, really. It's problem solving. It's figuring out that, okay, something that I'm doing here is fucking me up. What can I do to fix it? And it's just finding a way to get through a challenge. My challenge was getting over that hump, that first inch. I could get an inch and then fuck up. And then I'd make another inch and fuck up. And I'd make every inch was a fuck up. But once I realized I need to make my core wires longer for starters, needed to use a heavier gauge of wire for starters, needed to move the wires in certain ways in order for me to get through the wire successfully from beginning to end, it's a piece of cake now. The only other thing that I'll mention, and it's obvious, if you're using 36 gauge, don't pull. Pulling the wire is going to break the wire, and that happened on like one of my last ones. For the last time I broke the wire, but it was at the very end. I'd made about 3.5 inches of wire, which was enough for my single coil, and I pulled just a little bit too hard and popped it, but I was done, so it wasn't the end of the world. But yeah, it goes without saying, don't pull the fucking wire if you can help pulling the fucking wire. That's about all there is to it. Plus, stainless steel and nichrome, they can make some beautiful, beautiful colors together. The loops are all stainless steel, 36 gauge, and the core was 26 gauge nichrome. So building this coil, actually wrapping it is super easy. You just got to decide which way you want to wrap it. Of course, since I'm going with a Diamondback pattern, I want the Diamondback to show, so I'm going to wrap it so the Diamondback is on the outside. But you wrap it the other way, you've got an interesting pattern there too. You can really wrap it either way. If you want to show more of the core wires, you can wrap it the backwards way. If you want to show more of the braid and how that came together to create the Diamondback, you can do it that way. It really just depends upon what your braid you're making, I suppose. Mounting it in the Bonza, of course, you want to choose a good RDA for this particular build. An RDA with a wide build space and wide terminals. The terminals on the Bonza are awesome, but you want to choose something that's not going to force you to destroy the braid, pushing the wire into these terminals. The Bonza was perfect. It just swallowed the entire braid. And we're talking about a wire that's so thick that, it's so thick that to comfortably fit it in the Bonza, I can't do 5 wraps, I can only do 4. It's a big build, even using 36 gauge wire for the loops. I couldn't imagine using smaller than 36, to be honest with you. I mean, maybe 38, but I couldn't imagine braiding with 40. Not at this stage of the game. Maybe one day I can braid with 40, but it's like hair, and you can't pull at all. With even 36, you really don't want to pull the wires tight, because if you do, they're going to pop. So doing that with 40, it would be a real challenge. I wouldn't want to try it with 40, not at this stage of the game, maybe one day. But yeah, 36 gauge alone creates a pretty wide coil. So you need something with big terminals, and the Bonza is perfect for that. It's got really wide coils, it's got that clamping system on the bottom. It works beautifully with this particular build. Getting it all anchored in there is easy enough. You just don't want to disrupt the braid as much as possible. Just get it in there as cleanly as possible. Putting in the Bonza, I clip off the leads on one coil that I've installed, take out the coil, put in the other coil, clip those leads short, and then put the original coil back in. From there, it's really just pulsing the wire. Me, I like to get as much color out of a build like this as I can, so I'll take the build over to the sink and I'll put some soap on the coil, maybe take a bit of a brush and brush it out very gently, and then wash it all off. And then getting the coil colored, it's really just starting out really low. I started out pulsing this at 40, I got to my golds, and then I put it up to 50, and I pulsed it a bit more. I got my bronzes, my purples, and then I put it up to 60, and I got my blues and all that. And is that all of them? I think that's all of them. Like I went in 10 watt increments from 40 to 50 to 60. I think I may have gone to 70. And I really did not do a lot of tweezing, a lot of strumming my coils or anything like that. It's delicate. It's a delicate braid. It's 36 gauge, and it's wrapped in such a way that you've got, loops and braids, and they're sticking out loose on the sides at times. And I don't want to do anything that's going to disrupt that braid. I don't want to do anything that's going to malform the braid in the process. So really all I'm doing when I'm building this is I'm, pulsing little by little, giving it a little bit of heat to adjust here and there, and then I'm taking my bits and I'm working them in and out of the coil, jimmying them a bit. What would have worked really well here, and I forgot to use it, were those ceramic, these ceramic sticks from Coil Master. These would have worked really well on this build, and I forgot to use them, but yeah, they would work really well on this because it would keep the shape of the braid, keep the shape of the coil really well while I'm pulsing that coil. That's one thing that I wish I'd done, but other than that, like I said, very light on the tweezers. I think I just, once everything was glowing up right, I just gave them a small, very slight squeeze with the tweezers, being very careful not to upset the look of the braid. And I'm not even sure I should have even done that, but it didn't hurt the braid very much at all. And when I just really did it to make sure that everything was going to glow up right after a bit of pressure had been applied to the braid. Still was working fine. So from there, wicking it was just the usual wicking, good thick wicking, because this braid is going to bring in a lot of juice. It's going to hold a lot of juice in the braid itself, and a good bit of wicking is going to help to feed that braid, feed the braid over to the cores themselves, and just keep it very, very saturated. I accidentally did get a dry hit off this build. It's like a dry hit off of mesh almost, because that's essentially what you're creating. You're creating 36 gauge mesh with this braid, basically. So dry hit on it is no fun. Keep that in mind, keep it good and wicked and saturated, and it's going to be a very wonderful, wonderful vaping experience. These braids, they just create this net for juice to collect, and that net feeds those core wires, and it just makes for a delightful, delightful experience. And we're talking about just tons and tons of surface area, tons and tons of little crevices where that juice can collect and feed. You're basically creating sort of a twisted wire right down the middle with that Diamondback, and you've got a net of wire all around it in the form of the braid and the loops that we're collecting on the sides. And then you've got, you know, 2 core wires that are heating the wire overall and getting, yeah, it just vaporizes juice beautifully. I mean, single coil, just a fantastic experience. I mean, we're talking, you have to set about 90 minutes aside once you get comfortable with it to where you're going to be making this build. So it takes a bit of commitment. You know, it's a build that you have to commit to once you start, because stopping and starting again is not very easy with a braid like this. But if you can set aside 90 minutes for a single coil, it's absolutely worthwhile. One of the better builds that I've put together. Absolutely delicious. Anyway, that is the Diamondback Slentre Braidiator. The original concept really would be owed to Tommy Duquois, who created the vertebraid, Slentre Braid. Huge influence on the build community, on braiders who build, and yeah, former judge of Coil Wars too. Awesome, awesome build. Anyway, I appreciate all the things you guys do, the likes, the comments, the shares. I've got a list of affiliate links in the description on every video. Clicking those links helps me, helps the channel. I appreciate you. Just buying the things that you normally buy, using those links goes a long way. Anyway, until next time, I'm your homeboy Josh. Vape on, vapors.